No one noticed him at first. He didn't arrive in a limousine. There were no flashing cameras, no screaming fans pressed against the gates. That was the point. On that quiet day, a man walked toward Graceland dressed like a stranger. Plain clothes, no sunglasses, no signature swagger. His head slightly lowered, his steps careful. To anyone watching, he was just another visitor standing near the house that once belonged to a legend. But the truth was far stranger, because that man was Elvis Presley. The king of rock and roll was standing just a few feet from his own home, and no one recognized him. Graceland had become a shrine. Fans came from all over the world to feel close to Elvis, to touch the gates, to take photos, to imagine his presence. Ironically, the one person who could no longer enter freely was Elvis himself. Fame had turned his home into a museum, his life into a performance that never ended. And on this day, Elvis wanted something simple, something he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to know how people talked about him when they didn't know he was listening. He wanted to see Graceland the way fans saw it, not as a king, but as a ghost. As he stood there, fans spoke openly around him. Some laughed, some argued, some shared stories about the real Elvis, unaware that the real Elvis was right beside them, hearing every word. And that's when something quietly painful began to happen, because what Elvis heard that day would stay with him forever. But before we understand why he did this, before we understand what broke inside him, we have to go back to the moment Graceland stopped being a home and started becoming a cage. By this point in his life, Elvis was no longer just a man, he was a symbol. Every move he made was watched, every word he said was repeated, every mistake became a headline. Fame had given him everything, but it had also taken something precious in return: privacy. Graceland was supposed to be his safe place, a home where he could relax, laugh, and feel normal. But over time, it turned into a destination. Fans camped outside the gates. Tourists drove by just to catch a glimpse. Some cried, some prayed, some just wanted proof that Elvis was real. And Elvis felt it all. He loved his fans, but he was exhausted. He began to wonder something dangerous, something that haunted him late at night. Did they love me or the idea of me? That question is what led him to the disguise. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a stunt. It was a test. Elvis wanted to hear the truth, unfiltered, unguarded, and raw. He wanted to know what fans said when they thought he wasn't there, whether he still felt magic, or whether the legend had already started to fade. So he blended in. As he stood among them, listening, he realized something painful. People spoke about him like he was already gone, like he was frozen in time, a myth, a memory. And in that moment, Elvis understood the stakes. If the world no longer saw him as human, then maybe he had already lost something he could never get back. And what happened next, what he heard, and how it changed him, marked a point he could never return from. Because once you hear how the world talks about you behind your back, you're never the same again. It was not the kind of day people remember. No headlines, no cameras, no screaming fans rushing forward. Just an ordinary afternoon outside Graceland, where tourists stood quietly, taking photos, whispering stories, and imagining what it must have been like when Elvis Presley lived behind those gates. Among them stood a man no one noticed. He wore simple clothes, nothing flashy, no sunglasses, no signature hairstyle. His posture was calm, almost cautious, like someone trying not to be seen. To everyone else, he was just another visitor, but he wasn't. That man was Elvis Presley himself, standing in front of his own home, disguised, anonymous, and completely invisible. For the first time in years, the most famous man in the world was alone in a crowd. Graceland had become something strange. It was once a home filled with laughter, music, late-night conversations, and quiet moments of escape. Now it was a symbol, a destination, a place people came to worship a legend. Ironically, the one person who could no longer walk freely through its gates was the man who built it. Fame had turned Elvis into a prisoner of his own success. Everywhere he went, people stared, they pointed, they screamed. They expected him to perform, to smile, to be Elvis. But that day, he wanted something else. He wanted silence. He wanted truth. And most of all, he wanted to hear what people said about him when they believed he was not there. As Elvis stood among the fans, he listened. Some spoke with excitement, telling their children how Elvis once stood on that very balcony. Others debated stories they had heard, rumors, myths, half-truths, passed down like folklore. A few laughed, joking about his costumes or his later years. And none of them realized that the man they were discussing was standing just a few feet away, hearing every word. Elvis kept his face calm, but inside, something stirred. This was different from reading newspapers or hearing critics on television. This was raw, honest, unfiltered. These people were speaking from the heart, not knowing they were being heard by the very person they were judging. For a moment, Elvis felt something he had not felt in a long time: freedom. No one asked for an autograph. No one demanded a photo. No one expected him to sing. He was just a man listening to the world talk about Elvis Presley, as if he were a character in a story, not a living, breathing human being. That realization cut deep. Somewhere along the way, Elvis the man had been swallowed by Elvis the legend. And standing there, unnoticed, he felt both relief and sadness at the same time. He remembered the early days, before Graceland was famous, before the gates meant anything to anyone else. Back then, it was just a house, a dream fulfilled, a place where he believed success would finally bring peace. But success brought noise instead. Endless noise, applause that never stopped, even when he desperately needed silence. And now, standing outside his own home like a stranger, he understood something painful. Fame does not fade when you want it to. It stays, it watches, it follows. And sometimes it erases the person underneath. As conversations continued around him, Elvis felt the weight of what he was doing. This was not curiosity. This was not entertainment. This was a test. He wanted to know whether people still felt something real when they thought about him, or if he had already become a frozen image, locked forever in the past. Every sentence he heard felt like a small verdict. Some kind, some careless, some quietly cruel.
And Elvis absorbed them all, without reacting, without defending himself, because in this moment he had chosen to listen rather than speak. The irony was impossible to ignore. Fans traveled thousands of miles hoping to feel close to Elvis, while Elvis stood inches away from them, completely unseen. The distance between them was not physical, it was emotional, and that distance frightened him more than any screaming crowd ever had. Because if people could stand so close to him and still not see him, what did that say about who he had become? As the sun slowly lowered and shadows stretched across the gates of Graceland, Elvis felt something shift inside him. This experiment, this quiet return in disguise, was already changing him. He came looking for answers, but what he found was a question far more dangerous. Had the world already moved on from the man behind the music? And if so, where did that leave him? Elvis took a slow breath and looked once more at the house beyond the gates, a house full of memories, a house full of ghosts. He knew one thing for certain now. This day was not meaningless. What he was hearing, what he was feeling, would follow him long after he walked away. And as he turned slightly, blending back into the crowd, a thought echoed in his mind with unsettling clarity. This was only the beginning, and what he would hear next would change everything. Fame did not arrive in Elvis Presley's life like a blessing. It arrived like a storm. At first, it felt exciting. Crowds cheering his name, radios playing his songs, strangers smiling as if they already knew him. But over time, that storm never passed. It stayed, it grew louder, and slowly it began to close in on him. What once felt like freedom became a narrow space where every step was watched and every breath was judged. Elvis was famous everywhere, but nowhere did he feel truly safe from it. Graceland was meant to be his refuge. When Elvis bought the house, it was supposed to be the one place where the noise would stop, a place where he could walk barefoot, laugh with friends, and be himself without performing. But fame followed him through the gates. Fans gathered outside day and night, cars slowed down just to look. Some people cried at the fence, others shouted his name, hoping he might appear. The house became less of a home and more of a symbol, and symbols do not get to rest. Inside those walls, Elvis felt the pressure build. Every decision carried weight. Every change in his appearance became a headline. If he gained weight, the world noticed. If he looked tired, people whispered. He could not age quietly. He could not struggle in private. Even his silence was interpreted, analyzed, and turned into rumor. Elvis began to realize that people were no longer listening to him. They were listening to the idea of him, and that idea was something he could no longer control. That loss of control was frightening. Elvis often asked himself a question he never said out loud. Do they love me, or do they love the character they see on stage? The man behind the music was growing tired, but the legend was expected to stay forever young, forever powerful, forever perfect. And the distance between those two versions of himself kept growing. One lived in the spotlight, the other hid in quiet rooms, wondering when life had become so heavy. This was why the disguise mattered. It was not about tricking fans or playing a game. It was about survival.
Direct narration. Elvis needed to hear the truth, without applause, without fear, without people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear. Standing outside Graceland that day, unnoticed and unrecognized, he felt something rare: honesty. For the first time in years, people spoke about him without protecting his feelings. And that honesty, even when it hurt, felt more real than any standing ovation. As he listened, Elvis sensed something deeper than criticism. He sensed distance. People talked about him as if he belonged to another time, another version of themselves. They remembered how he made them feel when they were young, when life was simple, when music felt new. And in doing so, they unknowingly placed him in the past, not as a man still living, still struggling, still searching, but as a memory already finished. That realization tightened something in his chest, because if he had become a memory to the world, what did that make his present? Elvis understood the stakes now. This was not just about reputation, it was about identity. If the world only wanted the legend, then the man named Elvis Presley was slowly disappearing. And once a person disappears behind their own image, it is almost impossible to come back. As the afternoon stretched on, Elvis felt the weight of fate pressing in. This quiet experiment had crossed a line. He could not unhear what he had heard. He could not return to ignorance. The disguise had shown him something painful but necessary. Fame had not only taken his privacy, it had trapped him inside a version of himself that no longer matched who he was becoming. And somewhere deep inside, a dangerous thought began to form. If the world refused to see him as human, then maybe he needed to change the way he existed in that world, because staying the same was no longer an option. What Elvis did next, how he responded to this silent truth, would mark the beginning of a shift he could never undo. And the next voices he heard would cut even deeper. Elvis did not expect kindness, but he did not expect this either. Standing quietly among the fans, he heard his name spoken again and again, not with excitement, but with certainty. People spoke about Elvis Presley as if they knew him completely, as if his story was already finished. One man said Elvis had changed too much. A woman nearby shook her head and said the magic was gone. Another laughed softly and joked that fame had finally caught up with him. None of them meant to be cruel. They were simply honest, and that honesty landed harder than any insult ever could. Elvis felt each word settle inside him. These were not critics writing headlines. These were ordinary people, the ones he sang for, the ones he believed he understood. Hearing their unguarded opinions felt like watching his reflection slowly fade in a mirror. He realized something painful in that moment. People were no longer curious about who he was becoming. They only cared about who he used to be. Some fans defended him. They spoke about his voice, his generosity, the way his music once carried them through difficult times. But even those compliments were wrapped in the past. They spoke in memories, not in hope. And that hurt most of all. Elvis had spent his life creating moments that mattered, yet now those moments had become a museum, admired, preserved, and quietly closed. A young couple nearby talked about how Elvis used to feel rebellious, dangerous, alive. "He doesn't feel like that anymore," one of them said. Direct narration. Elvis felt the words strike something deep, because part of him agreed. Years of expectations, pressure, and isolation had worn him down. The world demanded energy, while giving little understanding in return. And standing there, anonymous, he wondered when he had started living to protect the legend instead of himself. There was a moment when Elvis almost spoke, almost corrected them, almost reminded them that he was still here, still breathing, still creating, still human. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. He chose silence. Because once you reveal yourself, the truth ends. And Elvis needed to hear it all,
no matter how painful it became. As more voices blended together, a pattern emerged. People did not see him as a man in motion. They saw him as a finished story, a chapter already written, already sealed. That realization shook him. If the world believed his best days were behind him, then anything he did next would be measured against a ghost. And ghosts always win. Elvis felt smaller than he ever had on a stage, smaller than he felt in quiet hotel rooms or empty recording studios. Because this time there was no applause to drown out the doubt, only reality, raw and unfiltered. And in that reality, he saw the cost of being untouchable. When people stop seeing you as human, they stop believing you can change. As the conversations drifted on, Elvis knew something inside him had crossed a line. He could not pretend anymore. He could not unknow what he now understood. The disguise had done its job. It had shown him the truth without mercy, and that truth demanded a response. Standing there, surrounded by voices that spoke about him as if he were absent, Elvis made a quiet decision. He would no longer allow the legend to erase the man. Something had to shift. Something had to break, because if he stayed silent forever, he would disappear completely. And just as that decision formed, a moment arrived, small, unexpected, and dangerous, one that nearly exposed everything. The moment came quietly, not with drama, not with music, just a sentence spoken without care. A man standing near the gates laughed and said, "I guess Elvis is just done now." The words were simple, casual, almost careless. But for Elvis, they landed like a final note held too long. For a brief second, the world seemed to narrow. The voices around him faded into a dull blur. He felt his chest tighten, not with anger, but with something heavier, recognition. This was not hatred. This was acceptance. The kind of acceptance that quietly ends a story without asking the person inside it for permission. Elvis felt an instinct rise inside him, a powerful, dangerous urge. Tell them, say something, let them know you're standing right here. He imagined it clearly. He could lift his head, say his name, watch their faces change. Shock, confusion, tears, apologies. The truth would explode into the moment and everything would shift instantly. The legend would collapse into the man again, if only for a second. But Elvis didn't move, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. Revealing himself would not fix what he had heard. It would only end the honesty. If he spoke, the truth would disappear behind screams and apologies. The fans would rewrite their words. Their raw thoughts would be replaced with admiration and fear. And Elvis didn't want that. He needed to know what the world really felt, without masks, just as he was wearing one now. So he stayed silent.
That choice was the point of no return. As the group continued talking, Elvis felt strangely calm. The pain was still there, but it had settled into clarity. He finally understood the distance between who he was and who the world believed him to be. And that distance wasn't caused by failure. It was caused by time, by memory, by the impossible weight of being frozen at your best moment forever. People didn't want Elvis to change. They wanted him preserved. That realization hurt, but it also freed him. For years, Elvis had been fighting expectations he could never meet, trying to be the version of himself that lived in other people's memories. But standing there, anonymous and unseen, he realized something profound. The legend no longer belonged to him, it belonged to the world, and chasing it was slowly destroying the man underneath. A young fan nearby touched the gate gently, almost respectfully, and whispered how much Elvis had meant to her father. Elvis felt his throat tighten. That was the truth, too. His music had mattered. It had changed lives. It had outlived moments. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the goal was never to be understood forever. Maybe it was simply to be felt, once, deeply.
As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, Elvis took one last look at Graceland, not as a stage, not as a symbol, but as a place filled with memories, good and painful, joyful and lonely. He understood now that returning in disguise was not about testing fans, it was about testing himself. And he had learned the answer. He could not live inside the past any longer. He could not keep measuring his worth through other people's memories. And he could not keep chasing the approval of a world that had already decided who he was supposed to be. Elvis slowly stepped away from the gates. No one noticed. No one stopped him. And in that anonymity, there was a strange peace. For the first time in years, he was not performing. He was not smiling on command. He was not carrying the weight of expectation. He was simply a man walking away from a version of himself that no longer fit. This moment did not change the world. There were no headlines the next day, no photos, no stories written about the day Elvis stood among his fans. And that was exactly why it mattered. Because some of the most important moments in a person's life happen without witnesses, without applause, without proof. They happen quietly, inside, when a truth finally settles. Elvis returned home that day not as a king, not as a legend, but as someone who had finally seen reality without illusion. He knew the world would continue to remember him in its own way, some kindly, some unfairly, some inaccurately. And he accepted that. What he would do next, how he would live with that understanding, would shape the rest of his life. But that day, at Graceland, disguised and invisible, Elvis Presley learned the hardest lesson of fame. You can be loved by millions and still feel unseen. And sometimes, choosing silence is not weakness. Sometimes, it is the final act of self-preservation.